The fire was dying. Sandor Clegane watched the embers glow and fade, like the breath of some sleeping beast. The wood had burned down to blackened fragments, and the flames that remained were thin and pale, barely enough to keep the night's chill at bay. He should have added another log an hour ago. He didn't. Around him, the riverland stretched dark and silent. The war had passed through here like a plague, leaving the land scarred and empty, burned fields, abandoned holdfasts, the occasional crow picking at something best left unnamed. This close to the god's eye, the air always felt heavy, thick with moisture and the smell of rotting leaves. The lake itself lay somewhere to the east, hidden behind a wall of skeletal trees whose branches clawed at the night sky. Sandor sat with his back against a fallen oak, his sword within easy reach, his cloak pulled tight against the cold. His horse, a ill-tempered destrier he'd stolen from a dead knight 3 weeks past, dozed. Nearby, its reins tied to a low branch. The animal didn't like him much. The feeling was mutual. He was alone. That wasn't unusual. Sandor Clegane had been alone most of his life, even when surrounded by people, especially then. At Joffrey's court, in the midst of feasts and tourneys, and all that horseshit pageantry, he'd felt more isolated than he did now, sitting by himself in the ruins of someone else's war. At least here, no one pretended. He reached for the wineskin at his belt, unstopped it, and took a long pull. The wine was sour and cheap, the sort of swill that tavern keepers sold to men who'd already had too much to care. It burned going down. Good. He took another drink. The fire crackled softly. A log shifted, sending up a spray of sparks that danced briefly before winking out. Sandor watched them rise and die, and something in his chest tightened. He'd always hated fire. Most men feared it, he supposed. Fire was dangerous, unpredictable, hungry. It consumed everything it touched. Wood, cloth, flesh. But most men's fear was distant, theoretical. They knew fire could hurt them, so they were careful around it. They didn't wake in the night drenched in sweat, dreaming of flames. They didn't flinch when a torch was lit too close. They didn't carry the memory of burning in their very skin. Sandor's hand drifted to his face, fingers tracing the ridges of scar tissue that covered the left side. The skin was thick and twisted, pulled tight over the bone. He'd long since stopped feeling it. The scars themselves had no sensation. But he felt the absence of feeling, if that made any damn sense. A dead thing grafted to a living one. He'd been, 6, 7, old enough to remember every moment of it, young enough to still believe the world had rules, that fathers protected their sons, that older brothers were supposed to keep you safe. Stupid boy. The wine sloshed in the skin as he took another drink. He should stop. He'd need a clear head come morning. The riverlands were crawling with broken men and deserters, and a drunk man was a dead man. But the wine dulled things, made the edges softer, and tonight he wanted soft edges. Tonight he wanted to forget. But forgetting had never worked. Not in 20-some years. The memories were always there, waiting. They lived in the smell of wood smoke, in the crackle of burning logs, in the dancing shadows cast by firelight. They lived in his scars, in his dreams, in the way people looked at him, some with pity, most with fear, or with disgust. The Hound, that's what they called him. Joffrey's mad dog, the Lannisters' killer. A man so brutal, so vicious, that even his face looked like something chewed up and spat out. They weren't entirely wrong. Sandor had killed his first man at 12, a poacher on Clegane lands, some half-starved fool trying to take a deer that belonged to his father. Gregor had caught the man and dragged him back to the keep, and their father had ordered Sandor to deliver the king's justice. "Make it clean," the old man had said. One stroke. He'd needed 3. The poacher had screamed. Sandor remembered that, remembered the way the man's blood had been hot against his hands, the way it had smelled like copper and shit. Remembered vomiting afterward, alone in the stables, while Gregor laughed. That was the first. There had been many since. He wasn't proud of it. Wasn't ashamed either, not really. Pride and shame were for men who had choices. Sandor had learned early that choice was an illusion. You did what you had to do to survive. You killed who you were told to kill. You served who you were told to serve. And if you were smart, you didn't think too hard about it. But tonight, sitting alone in the dark, with nothing but a dying fire and sour wine for company, he was thinking. That was dangerous. The fire popped again, louder this time, and Sandor's hand went instinctively to his sword hilt. He held there, tense, listening. The night sounds of the forest continued undisturbed. The rustle of wind through bare branches, the distant hoot of an owl, the creak of old wood settling. No footsteps, no voices, no steel whispering from sheaths. He forced himself to relax, though his hand remained near his blade. Old habits. In his line of work, paranoia kept you breathing. Work. That was a laugh, as if what he'd done could be called work, like a blacksmith at his forge or a farmer in his field. Honest labor, honest sweat. No, what Sandor did had other names. Murder, butchery, service to men who smiled while they ordered atrocities and called it justice. He'd been good at it, though. Had to admit that much. When Joffrey wanted someone killed, Sandor killed them. When Cersei wanted someone frightened, Sandor frightened them. Clean work, brutal work, the sort of work that let perfumed lords keep their hands soft and their consciences clear. The Hound does it. The Hound doesn't mind. Except he had minded. Somewhere deep down, in a place he didn't let himself look at too often, he'd minded every damn bit of it. The wine was half gone now. Sandor considered finishing it, decided against it. He stoppered the skin and set it aside, then reached for one of the logs he'd gathered earlier. The wood was damp. Everything in the Riverlands was damp, but it would burn eventually. He tossed it onto the coals and watched as smoke began to curl upward, grey against black. Fire was honest, at least. It didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. It consumed, it destroyed, it cared nothing for who or what stood in its path. There was a purity to that, a simplicity. Men were different. Men lied. They built elaborate fictions about honor and duty and righteousness, then used those fictions to justify whatever they wanted to do anyway. Knights swore oaths to protect the weak, then raped and murdered their way across the countryside. Lords spoke of justice, then hanged children for stealing bread. Kings called themselves chosen by the gods, then butchered anyone who disagreed. Sandor had stopped believing in any of it years ago. The songs, the stories, the pretty lies they told about how the world worked. He'd seen too much, done too much. But lately, and he wasn't sure when it had started, he'd begun to wonder if there was something else. Not honor, not in the way the knights meant it, but something. Some small piece of himself that wasn't just anger and bitterness and scars. The girl had something to do with it. Arya Stark. Wolfchild. Pain in the arse. She'd looked at him with those cold grey eyes and seen, what? Not the hound, not the monster. Something else. Something he'd forgotten was there. She hadn't been afraid of him. That was the thing. Every person Sandor had ever known had been afraid of him, except Gregor, who was too much of a monster himself to fear anything, and Joffrey, who'd been too stupid and cruel to understand fear. But this slip of a girl, this lordling's daughter, who should have been serving him wine and curtsying politely, had looked him in the eye and told him he was full of shit, and she'd been right. Sandor took a breath, let it out slowly. The night air was cold in his lungs, sharp and clean. Above, through breaks in the clouds, he could see stars, hard, distant points of light that had been burning since before men learned to make fire, and would burn long after the last fire died. He'd told her things, told her about Gregor, about the burning, about the lies, things he'd never told anyone, not in all his years. She'd listened without pity, without disgust, and when he'd finished, she'd said, "Your brother's a right bastard." Simple as that. No grand pronouncements, no empty sympathy, just acknowledgement, recognition. It had been something. He didn't have a word for it. The fire was catching now, flames beginning to lick at the new log. Orange light danced across the clearing, pushing back the darkness. Sandor watched it and felt the old familiar twist in his gut, the urge to move away, to put distance between himself and the heat. He stayed where he was. He'd spent his whole life running from fire, from the memory of it, from the pain of it, from what it represented. But fire wasn't the real monster. Fire was just fire. It burned because that's what fire did. The real monster had been the one who'd held him in it. Gregor, the mountain, his brother. The word tasted like ash in his mouth. People said they were alike, him and Gregor. Both big men, both killers, both wearing the Clegane hounds on their shields. But they were nothing alike. Gregor killed because he enjoyed it, because he was a rabid dog that should have been put down years ago. Sandor killed because he stopped himself. No point in making excuses. A man who killed was a killer, regardless of his reasons. The dead didn't care why you'd done it. But maybe, and this was a dangerous thought, one he'd been trying to avoid, maybe reasons mattered anyway. Not to the dead, but to the living, to the man who had to wake up every morning and remember what he'd done. Sandor rubbed his face, the scarred side and the whole side both. He was tired, not the kind of tired that sleep could fix, but tired in his bones, in his blood, tired of being the Hound, tired of being Sandor Clegane, tired of carrying around the weight of everything he'd done and everything that had been done to him. The fire crackled merrily, oblivious to his thoughts. Wood became heat and light and smoke, following laws older than men, simple, honest. When had he last felt simple? When had he last felt honest? Never, probably. Honesty was for people who could afford it. Sandor had been lying since he was old enough to understand that the truth could get you killed. Lying about how he'd gotten burned. Lying about whether it hurt. Lying about minding when people stared, when they whispered, when they looked at him like something that had crawled out from under a rock. The biggest lie was that he didn't care, that he was the Hound, and hounds didn't have feelings, didn't get hurt, didn't want things like normal men wanted things. But he did care. Gods help him. He cared. He cared that children looked at him with fear, He cared that women pulled away when he came near. He cared that men treated him like a weapon, useful but dangerous, something to be pointed at enemies and otherwise kept at arm's length. He cared that the first time someone had looked at him like he was a person instead of a monster, she'd been a child, young enough to be his daughter. The wine called to him again. Sandor ignored it. If he was going to think these thoughts, and apparently he was, because they wouldn't leave him alone, he wanted to think them clear-headed, wanted to face them the way he'd faced everything else in his miserable life, head on, no flinching. Men told stories to make sense of their sins. He'd heard that somewhere, or maybe he'd thought it himself. Either way, it felt true. Stories gave shape to chaos, made random cruelty into something with meaning. The songs did it, turned butchery into glory, made heroes out of killers. Sandor had never been a hero, knew he never would be, but maybe, sitting here by a dying fire in the ruins of someone else's war, he could tell his own story. Not the version people told about the Hound, but the real one. The one about a boy who'd been burned, and a man who'd burned in turn, and the long, empty years between. Maybe if he told it, even just to himself, even just in his head, he could make sense of it. Or if not sense, then at least peace, though peace seemed like a fool's hope for a man with his history. The fire had taken hold properly now, flames rising steady and strong. Heat washed over him, and Sandor felt sweat prickle on his brow. He didn't move, didn't pull back, just sat there and let the warmth touch his ruined face. Tomorrow, he'd have to move on. Find food, find work, find whatever passed for purpose in a world that had torn itself apart. But tonight, for this one night, he could sit still, could remember, could maybe, possibly, figure out what the hell he was supposed to do with the rest of his life, if he even had a life left to do anything with. The stars turned slowly overhead. The fire burned, and Sandor Clegane, the Hound, the killer, the monster, sat alone in the dark and tried to find words for things he'd never let himself feel. It was going to be a long night. Clegane's keep had never been a cheerful place. Sandor stared into the fire and let the memories come. They rose like smoke, unwelcome but inevitable. The keep, that's what everyone called it, though it had a proper name once. Some old word from the age of heroes that nobody remembered anymore. His father had been a third son, elevated to landed knight for loyal service to Tywin Lannister during some forgotten campaign. The keep was his reward, a square tower of grey stone squatting on a low hill in the western reaches of the Westerlands, surrounded by rocky fields that grew more stones than crops. It was a small holding, nothing like Casterly Rock, nothing like the great castles Sandor would see later in his life, but it was theirs, the Clegane seat, their place in the world. And from his earliest memories, it had been a place of fear. The fire popped, sending up sparks. Sandor watched them rise and remembered the smell of that place. Damp stone, rushes that needed changing, the kennels where his father kept the hounds that gave their house its sigil, hay and horse sweat from the stables, and underneath it all, something else, something he couldn't name as a child but understood now, the smell of violence waiting to happen. Gregor had been born angry. That's what the servants whispered when they thought no one was listening. Some children cried when they entered the world. Gregor had screamed, red-faced and furious, and he'd never really stopped. Sandor had been different, quieter. Their mother, and he barely remembered her, just fragments, the scent of lavender and the sound of soft weeping, had called him her gentle boy. That should have been a good thing. In any other family, maybe it would have been. In the Clegane house, gentleness was weakness. He'd been 4, maybe 5, the first time he truly understood what his brother was. There had been a litter of puppies in the kennels, 6 squirming bundles of brown and black fur, the kennel master's pride. Good hunting stock, he'd said, from the finest bitch in the Westerlands. Sandor had loved those puppies, spent hours sitting in the straw, letting them climb over him, licking his face with their tiny pink tongues. He'd named them all, though he couldn't remember the names now, except one, Soldier, a runt, smaller than his brothers and sisters, with a white patch over one eye. Gregor had been 12 then, already massive for his age, already mean. He'd come to the kennels one afternoon and found Sandor there, Soldier asleep in his lap. "That one's weak," Gregor had said. His voice had been changing, cracking between boy and man. "Father'll drown it." "No," Sandor had said, clutching the puppy closer. "The kennel master says he'll grow, says he's got spirit." Gregor had smiled. Sandor remembered that smile. It was the same expression he'd wear years later, standing over men he'd killed, children he'd hurt, women he'd destroyed. A smile that had nothing to do with joy and everything to do with power. "Give him here," Gregor had said. "I want to see." Sandor had known even then that giving Gregor the puppy was a bad idea. But what could he do? Gregor was bigger, stronger, older. Gregor was father's heir, the firstborn son, the one who mattered. And Sandor was just Sandor. He'd handed Soldier over. Gregor had held the puppy up, studying it like a thing in a market. Soldier had whimpered, his small legs kicking in the air. Then, almost casually, Gregor had closed his massive hand around the puppy's neck and squeezed. The sound Soldier made, Sandor could still hear it if he let himself. A high, desperate yelp that cut off suddenly into nothing. The other puppies had started howling. The bitch had lunged at Gregor, but he'd kicked her aside, sent her sprawling into the far wall of the kennel. "Weak," Gregor had said again. He'd dropped the small body into the straw and walked away, whistling. Sandor had sat there, staring at the dead puppy, unable to move, unable to cry, just frozen. That's what Gregor did. He took things that were small and vulnerable, and he broke them, and he did it with the same care most people gave to breathing. The kennel master had found him there an hour later, still sitting in the straw. The old man had scooped up Soldier's body without a word, patted Sandor's shoulder once, and left. They'd never spoken of it. That should have been a lesson. Should have taught Sandor to keep away from his brother, to avoid drawing Gregor's attention. But children don't learn lessons like adults do. Children still hope, still believe that maybe, somehow, things will be different next time. Sandor took another pull from the wineskin, though he'd promised himself he wouldn't. The memory of that day sat in his throat like a stone. The keep had been full of servants then, a steward who managed the household accounts, a cook and 2 kitchen girls, the kennel master and his son, a few men-at-arms who served as guards, a wet nurse for Sandor, though she'd left by the time he was 6. None of them had lasted long. Servants learned quickly that the Clegane household was not a good place to work. The pay was adequate, but the atmosphere was poison. Father was a hard man, cold and distant, more concerned with his hounds than his sons. Mother was Sandor struggled to remember. A ghost, really. A woman who'd been beautiful once, or so people said, but who'd faded into something pale and silent. She died when Sandor was 8. Fever, they said. But he'd heard whispers that she'd simply given up, stopped eating, stopped caring, let herself slip away. He couldn't blame her. And then there was Gregor. The servants had feared him most of all. Even as a boy, he'd been dangerous, quick to anger, brutal in his punishments, prone to sudden violence over imagined slights. A kitchen girl had served him meat that was too cold once. He'd thrown the plate at her head, opened a gash that needed 10 stitches. She'd left the next day. Father had done nothing, just told the steward to find a new girl. That was the thing Sandor remembered most clearly about those years. The silence, the way everyone pretended not to see. Gregor would hurt someone, break something, rage through the keep like a storm, and afterward everyone would just continue, as if nothing had happened, as if they hadn't heard the screaming, hadn't seen the blood. Sandor learned to be invisible, learned to move quietly through the halls, to make himself small, to avoid being noticed. When Gregor was in a mood, which was often, Sandor would disappear, hide in the stables, in the kennels, in the small godswood behind the keep, where a single heart tree grew, its white bark carved with a face worn smooth by centuries of wind. He'd sit beneath that tree and pray to gods he wasn't sure existed. Pray that Gregor would leave him alone. Pray that Father would notice, would care, would do something. The gods never answered. The fire had burned down again while he'd been lost in memory. Sandor fed it another log, watched the flames catch and grow. The heat pressed against his face, against his scars, and he let it. Punishment maybe, or just reminder. There had been good moments though. He forced himself to remember those too, few as they were. The kennel master, Harlan, his name had been kind to him, let him help with the hounds, taught him how to read their moods, how to earn their trust. Dogs are honest, Harlan had said more than once. They don't lie about what they are. Man could learn something from that. Sandor had spent more time in the kennels than anywhere else. The hounds didn't care that he was the younger brother, the spare. They didn't flinch when he came near. They just wagged their tails and licked his hands and were grateful for scraps and attention. He'd felt safer with the dogs than with people. And there had been other children, occasionally, sons and daughters of neighboring knights who'd visit the keep. Sandor had been shy around them, conscious of being a Clegane, of carrying his brother's reputation even before he had one of his own. But some of them had been nice, had played with him in the yard, taught him games with sticks and stones. Those visits never lasted long. Gregor made sure of that. There was a boy, Sandor couldn't recall his name, son of some landed knight from the east. They'd been the same age, and for one golden afternoon, they'd been friends, playing at swords with wooden blades running through the keep's small courtyard, laughing. Real laughter, the kind Sandor so rarely heard. Gregor had watched from the tower window. Sandor hadn't known it then, hadn't seen him, but he'd learned later. That night, Gregor had found the boy alone, cornered him in the stables, told him things. Sandor never learned what exactly, but from the boy's white face and shaking hands, it had been bad. Threats, probably. Promises of what Gregor would do if the boy ever came back. The family had left the next morning, earlier than planned. The boy hadn't looked at Sandor once. That became the pattern. Anyone who showed Sandor kindness, anyone who got too close, Gregor would drive away. Not always with violence, sometimes just with words, with looks, with the promise of violence that was somehow worse than the act itself. Sandor learned not to get close to anyone. The worst part, and he could admit this now, decades later, sitting alone in the dark. The worst part was that he'd started to believe what Gregor's actions implied, that he wasn't worth befriending, that there was something wrong with him, something broken, and that's why people left. That's why even the servants avoided meeting his eyes. Gregor had been the monster, but Sandor had been the one who ended up feeling monstrous. Father had been worse than useless. Lord Clegane, and that's how Sandor thought of him, even in memory as Lord Clegane, not father, had been a man carved from stone and duty. He cared about 3 things: serving House Lannister, maintaining the keep's modest fortunes, and his hounds, in that order. His sons had been obligations. Gregor was the heir, so he received training in arms, in estate management, in everything a landed knight's son needed to know. Sandor was the spare, so he received less. Some weapons training, enough to be useful. Basic letters and numbers taught by a maester who visited twice a year and seemed perpetually drunk. Lord Clegane never touched them, never embraced them, never spoke to them except to give orders or corrections. Sandor couldn't remember a single conversation with his father that hadn't been about duty, obligation, or disappointment. And when Gregor hurt him, hurt anyone, Father's response was always the same: silence, a turned back, a closed door. The message was clear: handle it yourself, or don't. Either way, don't bother me with it. Sandor fed the fire again, though it didn't need it. The flames leapt higher, casting wild shadows across the trees. In those shadows, he could almost see them: Father's stern face, Gregor's cruel smile, the frightened eyes of servants who knew better than to intervene. The keep had been a small world, but it had taught him everything he needed to know about the larger one. Power mattered, strength mattered. Everything else, kindness, justice, mercy, those were illusions. Pretty words that people used when they wanted to feel better about themselves. The strong did what they wanted. The weak suffered. And if you were smart, you figured out which one you were and acted accordingly. Gregor had been strong. Sandor had been something else. Not weak, not exactly, but younger, smaller, always one step behind, always in the shadow. That shadow had been a cold place to grow up. There had been one more thing, one more memory that stuck like a knife between his ribs. He'd been 6, maybe 7. There'd been a tourney at Casterly Rock. Not a great tourney, just a local affair, but large enough that Lord Clegane had taken his sons to watch, to be seen, to represent the house. Sandor had been excited. It was his first time leaving the keep, his first time seeing the wider world. Casterly Rock had seemed impossibly huge, carved into the living stone, rising up and up until it touched the sky. And the tourney, the bright banners, the armored knights, the thunder of hooves and clash of lances, it had been everything the songs promised. For one day, Sandor had believed in those songs, had believed that knights were noble, that they fought for honor, that the world was bigger and brighter than the grey walls of the keep. Then he'd seen Gregor ride in the lists. His brother had been 15, newly made a knight by their father's hand. Too young, really, but Lord Clegane had been eager to see his heir distinguished. Gregor had ridden against a hedge knight from the Riverlands, some poor bastard who'd probably thought an inexperienced opponent would be an easy win. The joust had been brutal. Gregor's lance had caught the man full in the chest, hadn't shattered like it was supposed to, had driven clean through the armor and into the flesh beneath. The hedge knight had fallen from his horse like a sack of grain, blood pouring from the wound. He'd died before the maesters reached him. The crowd had gone silent. Even at Casterly Rock, where violence was understood and often celebrated, that kind of kill was unusual, unnecessary. Gregor had lifted his helm, and Sandor had seen his brother's face. That same smile, that terrible, empty smile. Lord Tywin Lannister himself had been watching from the high seats. He'd stood, looked at Gregor for a long moment, then nodded once. Approval, recognition. That night, Gregor had been the toast of the feast. Lords and knights had clapped him on the back, called him fearsome, called him the Mountain. A new name for a new knight. Sandor had sat at the far end of the table and watched his brother become a legend. And he'd understood, with the clarity that sometimes comes to children, that this was how the world worked. Gregor would be celebrated for his cruelty, would be rewarded for it, would rise higher and higher while Sandor remained in the shadows, the younger brother, the spare, the one who didn't matter. The fire crackled, pulling him back to the present. The Riverlands knight pressed close around him, but in his mind he was still at Clegane's keep, still a child, still afraid, still waiting for someone to tell him it would be all right. No one ever had. Sandor took a breath, long and slow. These memories were poison, but maybe poison needed to be purged before it could stop killing you. Maybe that's what this night was about. Lancing a wound that had festered for 20 years. Or maybe he was just drunk and maudlin and looking for meaning where there wasn't any. Either way, the memories weren't done with him yet. There were more, darker ones. The day that had changed everything. The day when Gregor's cruelty had finally turned fully on him. The day of the fire. But that was another chapter, another wound. For now, he let himself sit with this one. The child he'd been, growing up in the shadow of a monster, learning that the world had no place for gentle boys. The Hound had been born in that shadow, even before the flames. He just hadn't known it yet. Some memories you can choose to revisit. You can pick them up, turn them over, examine them like stones worn smooth by a river. Those memories have edges, but the edges are dull, safe. Other memories choose you. Sandor stared into the flames and felt his throat tighten. He'd been circling this one all night, the way a man circles a pit filled with spikes, knowing he'd have to look down eventually, knowing what he'd see when he did. The wine was gone now. He'd finished it without noticing, and his head had that thick, fuzzy feeling that came with cheap drink on an empty stomach. Good. Maybe it would make this easier. Maybe it would dull the edges of what came next. It didn't. He'd been 7 years old. That much he knew for certain, because it had been just after his name day. There'd been no celebration. The Cleganes didn't celebrate much, but father had given him a new tunic, grey wool with the 3 black dogs sewn on the breast. Sandor had been proud of that tunic. It had made him feel like he mattered, like he was truly part of the house. He'd worn it for 3 days. The fire popped loudly, and Sandor flinched before he could stop himself. After all these years, after everything, His body still remembered fear. It had been winter, not the deep cold of a true winter. This had been before the long summer started, but cold enough that the hearths were kept burning day and night. The keep's great hall had a massive fireplace, big enough to roast a whole pig, and in the solar where Father conducted his business, there was a smaller one, more intimate, meant for warming rooms rather than cooking. That was the one Sandor had been playing. That's what he remembered first, playing with a toy that Gregor had discarded months before, a wooden knight painted in Lannister colors. It was a simple thing, carved by some servant who'd had a skill for woodwork. The paint was chipping, one of the arms was loose, but to Sandor it had been treasure. He'd created whole worlds with that knight. Epic battles, daring rescues, all the stories the singers told, but played out on the floor of the solar while Father was away, seeing to estate business. Gregor had been there. He was always there, like a shadow you couldn't shake, lying on one of the benches, supposedly reading a book, but mainly just picking his teeth and staring at the ceiling. The knight had been fighting a dragon. In Sandor's imagination, the dragon was as big as a castle, breathing fire that could melt stone. The knight was brave, charging forward with his lance, ready to save the kingdom. "That's mine," Gregor had said. Sandor had looked up. His brother was watching him now, no longer pretending to read. There was something in Gregor's expression that Sandor had seen before, but couldn't quite name. Not anger, exactly. Something colder. "You gave it to me," Sandor had said. His voice had been small. It was always small around Gregor. "I didn't give you anything. I threw it away. There's a difference." "But you said I could have it. You said you were done with it." Gregor had sat up then, slowly. The way large predators move when they've spotted prey. "I changed my mind. Give it here." Sandor's hands had tightened around the wooden knight. It was such a small thing. Worthless, really. Gregor had dozens of toys, real weapons, everything a lordling could want. He didn't need this one chipped wooden figure. But that was never what it was about with Gregor. "No," Sandor had said. The word had hung in the air like a sword drawn from its sheath. Sandor had never said no to his brother before, never dared. But something in him, some small spark of defiance, of self, had refused to give this one thing up. Gregor's face had changed, not to anger, something worse, a kind of cold interest, like a boy who'd found an insect and was deciding how to pull its wings off. "What did you say?" "It's mine. You don't want it. You just don't want me to have it." It was the truth. Sandor had known it even then, young as he was. Gregor didn't care about the toy. He cared about control, about making sure. Sandor understood his place. "Give it here." No. Gregor had stood then, all 6 feet of him, still growing but already massive. He'd crossed the solar in 3 strides. Sandor had scrambled backward, clutching the knight, his heart hammering in his chest. "You think you can tell me no?" Gregor's voice had been quiet. That was the terrifying thing. When Gregor got quiet, that's when you were in real danger. You think because Father gave you a tunic with our sigil on it, that you matter. You're nothing. You're a spare, a mistake. I'm your brother. The blow had come so fast, Sandor hadn't seen it. Gregor's fist, catching him on the side of the head, sending him sprawling. The wooden knight had flown from his hands, skittering across the floor. Sandor had lain there, ears ringing, tasting blood. He'd bitten his tongue when he fell. Gregor had picked up the knight, looked at it, then, almost casually, he'd snapped it in half and dropped the pieces. There, now neither of us has it. That should have been the end of it. Gregor had won, the way he always won. He should have left, should have gone back to whatever he'd been doing. But something in Sandor's face, tears maybe, or anger, or both, had made him pause. "You going to cry about it?" Gregor had asked. "Go running to father?" Sandor had pushed himself up on his elbows, spitting blood. Father wouldn't care anyway. He never does. It was the truth, and they both knew it. But saying it out loud, throwing it in Gregor's face, that had been a mistake. Gregor's eyes had narrowed. "You think you're clever? You think you understand how things work? I understand you're a bully and a coward." The second blow had been harder. Sandor's head had cracked against the stone floor, and for a moment, everything had gone white. When his vision cleared, Gregor was standing over him, breathing hard. "Say that again. Go on. Say it again." Sandor should have apologized, should have backed down, begged forgiveness, done what he'd always done. But something in him had broken open, some dam that had been holding back years of fear and resentment. "Coward," he'd said again. "You're only brave when you're hurting things smaller than you, puppies, servants, me." Gregor's face had gone dark red. "I'll show you what a coward looks like." He'd grabbed Sandor by the collar of that new tunic, the one with the 3 black dogs, and dragged him toward the hearth. Sandor had realized what was happening a moment too late. He'd started thrashing, kicking, screaming, but Gregor was so much stronger. "Stop! Gregor, stop! You want to call me a coward? You want to disrespect me in our father's house?" They'd reached the hearth. The fire was burning high. Someone had just added fresh logs, and the heat rolled off it in waves. Sandor could smell the wood smoke, the ash, the sharp tang of burning oak. "Gregor, please, you need to learn your place." Gregor had shoved Sandor's head toward the flames. Not into them, not yet, just close enough that the heat became pain, that the air itself felt like it was burning. Sandor had screamed, tried to pull away, but Gregor held him fast. "This is what happens to little boys who forget their place," Gregor had said, his voice calm, almost conversational. "This is what happens when you try to be something you're not. I'm sorry, please. Not yet, you're not." And then, Gregor had pushed his face into the fire. The pain was, there weren't words for it. Sandor had thought he'd known what pain was. Scraped knees, bruises from falling, the sting of Gregor's fists. This was different. This was his skin cooking, melting, the flesh of his face turning to char and ruin. The smell of it, his own burning flesh, sweet and horrible and wrong. He'd screamed. God, how he'd screamed. Screamed until his throat was raw, until the world narrowed down to nothing but fire and agony and the sound of his own voice breaking. Time had stopped meaning anything. It might have been seconds. It might have been hours. All he knew was pain and heat and the crackle of flames and his brother's hand on the back of his head, holding him there, holding him in the fire. And then Gregor had pulled him back. Sandor had collapsed on the floor, writhing, clawing at his face. The skin was still burning even though he was out of the fire, the heat trapped in his flesh, cooking him from the inside. He couldn't see out of his left eye. Everything was pain and darkness and the smell of burned meat. He'd heard shouting, Mother's voice, high and frightened. Servants running, someone throwing water on him, which somehow made it worse, made the pain sharper, made him scream again. It was an accident, Gregor had said. His voice had been loud, clear, carrying across the solar. He fell. He was playing too close to the fire, and he fell. Liar, Sandor had tried to say, but it came out as a gurgle. His face wasn't working right. Everything was swelling, distorting. The bedding caught fire, Gregor continued, and now Sandor could hear other voices agreeing, backing up the story. The servants, the guards, everyone who'd learned that contradicting Gregor Clegane was a good way to get hurt. I tried to pull him away, but it was too late. The bedding caught fire. Mother had been crying. Sandor remembered that. The sound of her sobs, helpless and defeated. She'd known. Of course she'd known. But what could she do? What could anyone do? Father had arrived then. Lord Clegane, summoned from whatever business he'd been about. He'd looked at Sandor on the floor, looked at Gregor standing tall and calm, looked at the servants huddled in the corner. What happened? An accident, Father, Gregor had said. He was playing near the fire. The bedding caught. I tried to save him. Father's eyes had settled on Sandor, the boy he'd been, writhing in agony, his face a ruin. And for just a moment, one brief moment, Sandor had thought he'd seen something in his father's face. Recognition, maybe. Understanding. But then Father had looked away, had turned to the servants. Send for the Meister. Clean this up, and someone put out that fire before it spreads. That was all. No questions about how a child could fall into a fire that was at chest height. No questions about why the bedding had caught, but nothing else had. No questions at all. The lie had been accepted, written into truth, and Sandor's screams had faded into the background, unimportant, already forgotten. The Meister had come, an old man from Lannisport, half-blind himself, who'd done what he could. Milk of the poppy for the pain, poultices for the burns, bandages that had stuck to the wounds and had to be peeled away each day, taking fresh skin with them. The healing had taken months. The pain had lasted longer. And when the bandages finally came off, when Sandor had finally been allowed to see what remained of his face, he'd understood that nothing would ever be the same. The left side was destroyed. The skin melted and twisted, pulled tight over the bone. His ear was a nub of scar tissue. His eye worked, but the lid didn't close properly anymore, leaving it perpetually exposed, weeping. His mouth was twisted at the corner, frozen in a permanent sneer. He'd looked like a monster, 7 years old, and his life was over. Sandor stared at the fire now, decades later, and felt the phantom pain of that day. His scars didn't hurt. They hadn't for years. But the memory of the pain was sharp enough to cut. Gregor had never apologized, never acknowledged what he'd done, had continued on as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't deliberately maimed his own brother for the crime of saying no. And Father had let him, had accepted the lie, had turned his back on his younger son and pretended that everything was fine. That was the thing that had hurt worse than the burning in the end. Not that Gregor had done it. Sandor had already known his brother was a monster, but that Father had let him, that everyone had let him, that the truth had been right there, obvious to anyone who cared to see, and they'd all chosen blindness. The world had taught him a lesson that day, a lesson written in scar tissue and pain. The truth doesn't matter. Power matters. And if you're not strong enough to defend yourself, no one will defend you. Sandor had learned that lesson well. He'd become the Hound because that day had shown him there was no other choice. You either became a monster yourself, or you spent your life at the mercy of monsters. There was no third option, no escape, no justice, just power and pain, and the choice of which side you wanted to be on. The fire was dying again. Sandor let it. He was tired of feeding it, tired of watching the flames, tired of remembering. But the memories weren't done with him yet. There was more to tell. The years after the burning, growing up with a ruined face in a world that valued beauty. The slow transformation from victim to victimizer. The path that had led him from that solar to here, to this moment, to a man who'd spent his life becoming the thing he hated most. But that would come later. For now, he let himself sit with this memory, this wound. The day the fire came and took everything. The day Sandor Clegane died and the Hound was born. The fever had lasted 3 weeks. Sandor poked at the fire with a stick, watching sparks spiral upward into the dark. Those weeks after the burning existed in his memory as fragments, pieces of a broken mirror that reflected pain and confusion and the bitter taste of milk of the poppy on his tongue. He remembered the master's hands, surprisingly gentle for such an old man, changing bandages that stuck to his wounds. Remembered screaming when the cloth pulled away, taking fresh skin with it. Remembered his mother's face, pale and drawn, hovering at the edge of his vision like a ghost. Mostly, he remembered the pain. The master had warned them, father, mother, whoever was listening, that the boy might not survive. Burns like that, covering so much of the face, the risk of corruption in the blood was high, and even if he lived, there would be scarring, extensive scarring. The boy will be marked for life, the Meister had said, his voice clinical, detached. The skin may heal after a fashion, but it will never be as it was. Father had nodded, asked about the cost of treatment, paid it without complaint. That was something, Sandor supposed. Father had paid to keep him alive. That was more than some lords would do for a spare son, a child who'd outlived his usefulness the moment his brother was born. But father never visited the sick room, never asked how Sandor was healing, never came to sit with him through the long nights when the pain was so bad that even the poppy couldn't touch it. Mother came, every day, for those first few weeks. She'd sit by his bed and hold his hand, the right one, the one that wasn't, bandaged, and tell him stories, old tales from her own childhood in some minor house in the Reach, stories about knights and ladies, about honor and courage, about how good things came to those who endured. Lies, all of them, but they'd been kind lies, and he'd needed them. She'd died 2 years later. The fever took her, same as it took so many. Or maybe she'd just given up. Sandor had never been sure which, but in those weeks after the burning, she'd been there. And so had Harlan, the kennel master. Old Harlan, with his weathered face and patient hands, who smelled of dogs and hay and leather. He'd come to the sick room every evening after the Meister had finished his work, and Mother had kissed Sandor's forehead and left him to the darkness. Harlan would sit in the chair beside the bed and talk. Not about the burning, not about what had happened. Those first few visits, he didn't mention it at all. He just talked about the kennels, about the hounds and their litters, about which dogs were hunting well and which needed more training. Storm's bitch dropped her pups yesterday, he'd said on the third night. 6 of them, all healthy. Got the look of their father about them. Good deep chests, strong legs. They'll be fine hunters when they're grown. Sandor had listened, focusing on Harlan's voice instead of the pain. The Meister had just changed his bandages. His face felt like it was still on fire. You'll come see them when you're well, Harlan had continued. They'll need names. You always had a gift for that. Will they run from me? Sandor had asked. His voice had been thick, strange. The burns on his face made it hard to speak clearly. Harlan had been quiet for a moment. Then, dogs don't care what you look like, boy. They care about how you treat them. You've always been good to my hounds. They'll know you. It was the first time anyone had acknowledged that Sandor would look different, that his face was ruined. The Meister had skirted around it. Mother had pretended everything would be fine, and Father hadn't said anything at all. But Harlan had spoken it plain. Dogs don't care what you look like. Sandor had started crying then. Silent tears that burned in his wounds and made everything hurt worse. Harlan had pretended not to notice, just kept talking about the hounds until Sandor fell asleep. The kennel master came every night after that. And slowly, as the weeks passed and the fever broke and Sandor began to heal, or what passed for healing, Harlan had started teaching him things. Not about dogs, not at first, about people. The world's full of liars, Harlan had said one evening, maybe a month after the burning. Men who'll smile to your face and plot your ruin behind your back. Men who'll swear oaths they never mean to keep. Men who'll hurt you and call it justice. Sandor had been sitting up by then, the bandages reduced to just a wrapping around his head. The wounds were still raw, still weeping, but he could move without feeling like his face was tearing apart. Why? He'd asked. Why do men lie? Harlan had shrugged. Power, mostly. Fear, greed, sometimes just meanness. Some men are born with poison in them, and it's got to come out somehow. Like Gregor. It was the first time Sandor had said his brother's name since the burning. Harlan had looked at him, really looked at him, and nodded slowly. Like Gregor. Father believes his story, that it was an accident. Your father believes what's convenient to believe. Gregor's his heir. Harlan had paused, choosing his words carefully. You're the spare. And a lord can't admit that his firstborn is a monster, can he? That'd reflect poorly on the house. On him. So I'm supposed to pretend to? Supposed to lie? You're supposed to survive. That's all any of us can do. Survive, and try to keep some part of yourself decent while you're at it. Sandor had touched his bandages, feeling the rough cloth over the ruins beneath. I don't think there's anything decent left. That's the pain talking, and the anger. Both are fair, mind you, but they're not all you are. What else am I? Harlan had stood then, preparing to leave for the night. At the door, he'd paused and looked back. That's for you to decide, boy. World will try to tell you what you are. Your brother, your father, every person who sees your face, they'll all have opinions. But in the end, it's your choice. You can be what they expect, or you can be something else. Like what? Like someone who doesn't give up. Someone who doesn't let the bastards win. Then he'd left, and Sandor had been alone with those words, turning them over in his mind like stones. The bandages had come off 2 months after the burning. Sandor remembered that day with perfect clarity. The Meister had unwrapped the cloth slowly, gently, while Mother stood in the corner, wringing her hands. Father wasn't there. He'd sent word that he had business in Lannisport, and Gregor was somewhere. Sandor hadn't seen his brother since that day. Gregor had made himself scarce, and no one had forced him to visit. The Maester had pulled away the last layer of cloth, and Sandor had felt air on his wounds for the first time in weeks. It had hurt. Everything still hurt. "Fetch a glass," the Maester had said to one of the servants. "No," Sandor had said. "I want to see." The Maester had hesitated, exchanged a glance with Mother. She'd nodded, though her face had been very pale. They'd brought a looking glass, polished silver, large enough to see his whole face, the same glass Mother used when she fixed her hair. Sandor had looked. The left side of his face was gone. Not literally. The flesh was still there, the bone beneath intact. But it didn't look human anymore. The skin was twisted, pulled tight, a mass of scar tissue that went from his scalp down to his jaw. His ear was a melted stub. His eye was there, still working, but the lid drooped and couldn't close all the way. His mouth pulled up at the corner in a permanent sneer. He'd looked like something burned, something dead that was still walking around. He'd stared at his reflection for a long time. Mother had started crying quietly. The Maester had cleared his throat and talked about salves, about how the scars might fade with time, about how he was lucky to be alive. Sandor hadn't felt lucky. He'd handed the glass back without a word and walked out of the room, out of the keep entirely, still wearing his nightshirt, barefoot on the cold stone. He'd gone to the kennels. Harlan had been there, of course. The old man was always there. He'd looked up when Sandor came in, took in the boy's ruined face without flinching, and nodded once. Wondered when you'd come. Sandor hadn't trusted himself to speak. He'd just stood there, shaking, from cold or shock or rage he didn't know. "Storm's pups are in the back," Harlan had said, going back to whatever he'd been doing. "Been waiting for you to name them. They're getting too old to go without." Sandor had walked to the back of the kennels on legs that felt like water. The pups were there, 8 weeks old now, tumbling over each other in their pen. When they saw him, they'd started wagging, pushing against the gate, eager for attention. They hadn't cared about his face, hadn't even seemed to notice. Sandor had opened the pen and sat down in the straw. The puppies had swarmed him immediately, licking his hands, his arms, climbing into his lap. One of them, a bold female with a white spot on her chest, had stretched up and licked his face, the scarred side. He'd started crying then. Really crying, not the silent tears from before, but great shaking sobs that hurt his healing wounds and made his whole body ache. Harlan had let him cry, had come over after a while and sat down beside him, one weathered hand on Sandor's shoulder. "Dogs don't lie," the kennel master had said quietly. "They see what's true, and they know you're the same boy you were before, same soul, same heart. I'm a monster. You're a boy who got hurt. There's a difference. No one will ever look at me without seeing this." Sandor had gestured at his face. That's probably true. People are shallow creatures, most of them. They see what's on the surface and think they understand what's beneath. Then what's the point? What's the point of anything? Harlan had been quiet for a long moment, watching the puppies play. Then, "The point is that you're alive. The point is that you get to choose what kind of man you become. Your face is marked, but your soul doesn't have to be." "I want to kill him," Sandor had said. His voice had been very small. I want to kill Gregor. I know. I hate him. I hate Father for not seeing the truth. I hate everyone who pretended it was an accident. I know. So what do I do? Harlan had sighed, long and deep. You survive. You grow. You get strong enough that no one can hurt you like that again. And then you decide what kind of man you want to be. A man who kills his brother. Maybe, or maybe something else. But first, you survive. The puppy with the white spot had curled up in Sandor's lap, already half asleep. He'd stroked her soft fur and felt something in his chest ease, just slightly. I want to call this one Grace, he'd said. Harlan had smiled. That's a good name. From that day on, Sandor had spent more time in the kennels than anywhere else in the keep. Harlan had taught him everything: how to train hounds for hunting, how to care for them, how to read their moods and earn their trust, how to be patient, how to be firm but fair, how to command respect without cruelty. A good dog will die for you, Harlan had said, but only if you're worth dying for. You have to earn it every day. The hounds had become Sandor's companions. They didn't care that his face was ruined, didn't whisper when he walked by, didn't flinch or stare or pity him. They just wagged their tails and pressed against his legs and were grateful when he brought them scraps from the kitchen. Grace, the puppy with the white spot, had become his shadow. She'd followed him everywhere, slept outside his door, sat with him in the godswood when he needed to be alone. She'd been loyal in a way no person had ever been, until Gregor had killed her. Sandor closed his eyes, feeling the old familiar rage rise in his chest. He'd been 10 when it happened, 3 years after the burning. Gregor had found Grace sleeping in the courtyard and decided, for no reason except that he could, to kick her to death. Sandor had heard her yelping, had run to the courtyard and found his brother standing over the broken body of his dog, smiling that same cold smile. Shouldn't let animals roam free, Gregor had said. They get in the way. Sandor had attacked him, had thrown himself at his brother with no thought for the size difference, no thought for anything except making Gregor hurt the way Grace had hurt. It had lasted about 10 seconds. Gregor had beaten him bloody, broken 2 of his ribs, and left him lying in the dust beside his dead dog. Father had done nothing. The dog was just a dog, he'd said. Animals die. That's the way of things. Harlan had helped Sandor bury Grace beneath the heart tree. They dug the grave together in silence, and when it was done, the kennel master had put a hand on the boy's shoulder. I'm sorry, lad. I hate him. Sandor's voice had been flat, empty. I'm going to kill him someday. Maybe. But don't let that hate poison everything else. Don't let it make you like him. But it had, hadn't it? Over the years, the anger had grown, festered, turned into something dark and hard. And Sandor had learned Gregor's lessons well. Be cruel before someone's cruel to you. Hurt before you're hurt. Trust nothing and no one. Become the monster they already think you are. Harlan had tried, had done his best to show Sandor another way. But in the end, the world had been too much. The stares, the whispers, the constant reminder that he was damaged, ruined, wrong. The kennel master had died when Sandor was 14. Old age, natural causes. He'd been found in his sleep, peaceful, with Storm's great-great-grandson curled up beside him. They'd buried him beside the kennels he'd loved. Sandor had been the only one to cry. After that, there'd been no one left at the keep who gave a damn about him. No one except the dogs, and they couldn't speak. couldn't tell him there was something worth saving in himself. So he'd stopped trying to save it. The fire was nearly dead now, just embers glowing in the dark. Sandor looked at it and thought about Harlan, about the man who'd tried to teach him that dogs were better than people because they were honest, because they loved without conditions. Dogs don't care what you look like, but people did. And in the end, Sandor had learned to be a man of people's world, not a dog's. He'd learned to be the Hound. Sandor had been 16 when he left Clegane's keep for the last time. He fed the fire another log, watching the flames catch and spread. 16. Still young, though he'd felt ancient by then. The years between Harlan's death and his departure had been empty ones. He'd trained with the master at arms, learned to fight properly, grown into his size. By 16, he'd been nearly as tall as Gregor, though not as broad. Quick, though, quicker than his brother, and that was something. He'd thought about killing Gregor, thought about it every day, planned it in his head during the long watches, the quiet hours, a knife in the dark, poison in his wine, an accident during training, a sword thrust that went too deep. But he'd never done it. Not because he'd lacked the courage, though maybe that was part of it, but because he'd known, with the cold certainty that came with growing up in the Clegane's household, that killing Gregor would accomplish nothing. Father would hang him for kinslaying. The Lannisters would demand justice, and Gregor would still be dead, which meant Sandor would die too. And what was the point of that? So when Lord Tywin Lannister had sent word that he required men for his household guard, Sandor had volunteered. Father had barely acknowledged his leaving. A nod, a dismissal, instructions to represent the house well. No farewell, no blessing. Just the same indifference he'd shown since the day of the burning. Gregor had been at Casterly Rock already, serving as one of Tywin's knights. The Mountain, they were calling him now. Sir Gregor Clegane, famous for his size and his brutality. He'd distinguished himself in some minor campaign against the Rains or the Tarbecks. Sandor couldn't remember which. All he knew was that his brother had found his calling, killing people for lords who wanted them dead. Sandor had ridden to Casterly Rock alone, with nothing but his horse, his sword, and the clothes on his back, and the scars on his face, of course. Those he carried everywhere. The Rock had been everything the keep wasn't. Massive, wealthy, crawling with servants and guards and lordlings who moved through the halls like they owned the world. Which, in a sense, they did. The Lannisters were the richest house in Westeros, and they made sure everyone knew it. Sandor had reported to the captain of the guard, a hard-faced man named Stafford Lannister, some cousin to Lord Tywin. Stafford had looked him up and down, taking in his size, his scars, his resemblance to Gregor. "You're the Mountain's brother," Stafford had said. "Aye. Can you fight?" "Well enough." "We'll see. Report to the training yard at dawn. You'll start with the other recruits. If you're half as good as your brother, you'll do fine. If not, we'll find other work for you." That had been it. No welcome, no questions about what he wanted or what he could do. Just orders. Sandor had found that oddly comforting. At least here, no one pretended to care. The training yard had been brutal. Stafford had run them hard. Drills, sparring, conditioning. Testing to see who had the stomach for real fighting and who would break when things got bloody. Sandor hadn't broken. He'd been good. Better than good, actually. Years of rage and pain had made him vicious with a blade, and his size gave him reach. He'd put down every man he'd faced in those first weeks, including a few who'd been serving at the Rock for years. Word had reached Lord Tywin. The Lion himself had come to watch one afternoon, standing in the gallery above the yard while Sandor sparred with one of the sworn swords. It had been a hard fight. The man was experienced, new tricks Sandor hadn't seen before, but Sandor had been faster, meaner. He'd ended it with his blade at the man's throat. Lord Tywin had nodded once. That night, Sandor had been summoned to his solar. The Lord of Casterly Rock had been sitting behind a massive desk of carved oak, studying papers by candlelight. He hadn't looked up when Sandor entered, just gestured to a chair. "Sit." Sandor had sat. Tywin had continued reading for another minute, maybe two. A power play, Sandor had realized, making him wait, making him understand who had control. Finally, Tywin had set the papers aside and looked at him. Those eyes, cold as winter ice, missing nothing. They'd settled on Sandor's scars for a moment, then moved on as if they were just another feature. No pity, no disgust, just calculation. "You fight well," Tywin had said. "Thank you, my lord. Your brother tells me you hate him." The directness had caught Sandor off guard. He'd opened his mouth, closed it. What was he supposed to say to that? "I see," Tywin had continued, as if Sandor's silence was answer enough. "Gregor also tells me you blame him for your injury. He put my face in a fire when I was 7. He says it was an accident. He's lying." Tywin had leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "Possibly. Gregor is many things, but honest isn't one of them. Still, it happened a long time ago. You're here now. That suggests you've moved past it." Sandor had said nothing. He hadn't moved past anything, but what did that matter? "I need men I can rely on," Tywin had said. "Men who follow orders without question. Men who aren't squeamish about doing what needs to be done. Your brother is useful in that regard. Are you?" "I can follow orders." "That's not what I asked." Sandor had met those cold eyes. "I can do what needs to be done, even if it's unpleasant. I've lived with unpleasant my whole life, my lord. I can handle more." Tywin had smiled then. Not warmth. Tywin Lannister didn't do warmth, but something like approval. "Good. You'll start in the household guard. If you prove yourself, there may be other opportunities." That had been the beginning. Sandor poked at the fire, watching sparks dance upward. Those first years at Casterly Rock had been... what? Not good exactly, but better than the keep. At least here, he'd had purpose. Orders to follow. Work to do. The household guard was responsible for protecting the family, maintaining order in the Rock, handling threats both inside and outside the castle walls. Most of it was routine, standing watch, patrolling corridors, breaking up the occasional fight between drunk servants. But some of it wasn't routine. Sandor's first real job had come 3 months after he'd arrived. A servant had been caught stealing from Lord Tywin's personal chambers. Jewelry mostly. Small things the man had thought wouldn't be missed. He'd been wrong. Stafford had pulled Sandor aside one evening. "Lord Tywin wants the thief dealt with, quietly. Take him to the cliffs north of the Rock and handle it." "Handle it how?" Stafford had given him a look. "However you see fit. Just make sure he doesn't come back." The servant had been a thin man, middle-aged, with a wife and children in Lannisport. He'd begged when they'd dragged him from his cell. Promised to return what he'd stolen, sworn he'd never do it again, offered to take any punishment except death. Sandor had walked him to the cliffs in silence. The man had cried the whole way. At the edge, looking down at the rocks and the sea far below, the man had fallen to his knees. "Please, please, I have children. A daughter, she's only 8. Who'll care for them if I'm gone?" Sandor had thought of his own childhood, of being 8 years old, of having no one to protect him, of the world's indifference to suffering. Then he'd pushed the man off the cliff. The body had washed up 2 days later. Officially, it had been ruled an accident, a tragic fall. The man's family had been given a small sum from the Lannisters' coffers, charity, they'd called it, and told not to make trouble. They hadn't. Sandor had gone back to the rock and reported to Stafford that the job was done. The captain had nodded, satisfied, and that had been that. No questions about how Sandor felt about it. No concerns about whether he could handle more. Just acceptance that he was the kind of man who could do what needed doing, and he'd been right to accept it because there had been more, much more. A minor lordling who'd insulted Lady Joanna at a feast. Sandor had found him in his chambers and beaten him bloody, made sure he understood that disrespecting the Lannisters came with consequences. The man had left the rock the next morning, his face swollen, his pride broken. A merchant who tried to cheat House Lannister on a shipment of grain during a lean year. Sandor had paid him a visit with 2 other guards. They'd broken the man's hands, destroyed his records, burned his warehouse. A message to others who might think about crossing the lions. A servant girl who'd gotten pregnant by one of Lord Tywin's younger cousins. She'd been planning to claim the child was his, to demand support or acknowledgement. Sandor had been sent to convince her otherwise. He'd given her enough coin to leave Lannisport and start over somewhere else. Told her what would happen if she ever came back. She'd taken the money and run. Not all of it had been threats and violence. Sometimes it was just presence. Standing behind Lord Tywin during difficult negotiations, a reminder of what happened to those who pushed too hard. Standing guard outside chambers where sensitive conversations happened, making sure no one listened who shouldn't. Being a weapon. That's what it came down to. Being the knife in the dark that kept people in line. Sandor had been good at it. Too good, maybe. The fire crackled and he took another drink, though the wine was long gone. His throat was dry, but that was probably for the best. Getting properly drunk would make the memories harder to face, and for some reason, stubbornness, maybe, or stupidity, he wanted to face them clear-eyed. After a few years, Lord Tywin had assigned him to the children, Cersei, Jaime, and young Tyrion. Protection, officially, though the twins hardly needed protecting within the rock's walls. It was more about making a statement, about showing the world that the Lannister children warranted the best guards, the most fearsome warriors, and about keeping Tyrion safe from Cersei. The dwarf had been 7, 8, a small, clever boy with mismatched eyes and a gift for saying things that made his sister furious. Cersei had hated him from birth, blamed him for their mother's death, made no secret of her desire to see him suffer. Sandor had been assigned to make sure she didn't act on that desire. It had been strange work, following a child around, keeping him from harm, not from outside threats, but from his own sister. Watching Tyrion read in the library, walking behind him in the corridors, standing outside his chambers at night in case Cersei decided to visit with malice in mind. The boy had noticed, of course. Tyrion was sharp, saw things others missed. "You're here to protect me from her, aren't you?" he'd asked one day, looking up from his book. Sandor had said nothing. "It's all right. I know what she is, what she's capable of. Father knows too, I think. That's why you're here. Lord Tywin's orders are Lord Tywin's orders." Indeed. Tyrion had gone back to his book, but not before adding, "Thank you, anyway." It had been the first time anyone at the Rock had thanked him for anything. Years had passed like that. Sandor had grown into his role, become known as one of Tywin's most reliable men, not because he was the best fighter, though he was good, but because he could be counted on. He didn't ask questions, didn't have qualms, did what he was told, when he was told, without complaint. The Hound, some of the other guards, had started calling him, because of his house sigil, supposedly, but also because of how he fought. Vicious, relentless, going for the throat, like a dog that had been beaten too many times and learned to bite first. Sandor hadn't minded the name. It was better than being Gregor's brother, better than being the burned boy. The Hound was something new, something he'd made himself, even if what he'd made was a monster. Then King Aerys had called for Lord Tywin to serve as Hand of the King. The whole household had moved to King's Landing, that sprawling, stinking city built on Aegon's ambitions. Sandor had gone with them, of course. By then, he'd been part of the household for nearly 8 years, had earned his place through blood and obedience. King's Landing had been different from the Rock. Dirtier, more dangerous, full of people who thought themselves important. The capital had a way of inflating egos, making minor lordlings think they were players in the great game. Sandor's job had stayed the same, though. Protect the family, handle problems, be the wolf that kept the sheep in line. And then Robert's rebellion had happened. The realm had torn itself apart. Aerys had gone mad. And when the dust settled, there was a new king on the throne. Robert, Baratheon, the warrior who'd killed Rhaegar Targaryen at the Trident. Tywin had bent the knee, brought his armies to King's Landing, and presented Robert with the bodies of Rhaegar's children as proof of Lannister loyalty. Sandor had been there that day, had seen the small corpses wrapped in Lannister crimson, had heard the whispers about how Gregor had killed them, the princess and the babe both, smashed and stabbed and left to rot, his brother's finest work. Robert had made Jaime Lannister a Kingsguard knight, had married Cersei to seal the alliance, had appointed Tywin as Hand again, though that hadn't lasted long. The king and his Hand had disagreed about everything, really. Within a year, Tywin had gone back to Casterly Rock in disgust. But Cersei had stayed. The queen now, married to a drunk who preferred war stories and whores to her bed. And she'd wanted her own guards, men she could trust, men who'd been loyal to her family rather than to the Fat King. She'd asked for Sandor. Lord Tywin had agreed. Another tool to keep his daughter safe, to keep his interests protected in the capital. Sandor had been transferred to the royal household, assigned to protect Queen Cersei and her children, especially Joffrey. The boy had been 7 when Sandor had first been assigned to him, old enough to show what he'd become. A little monster, beautiful and cruel, with his mother's looks and none of her cunning. Just malice dressed up in princely clothes. Joffrey had liked Sandor immediately. liked having a guard who looked frightening, who people feared, liked ordering him around, testing to see what he'd do. "Kill that cat," Joffrey had said one day, pointing at a stray that had wandered into the courtyard. Sandor had looked at the boy, 8 years old, maybe 9, already rotten to the core. "No. What? I don't kill cats because you're bored, boy." Joffrey's face had gone red. "I'm a prince. You have to do what I say. I protect you. I don't do your killing. For you. You want the cat dead, kill it yourself." The boy had stared at him, shocked that anyone would refuse. Then he'd smiled, that same smile Gregor wore, and nodded. "You're right. I should do it myself." He'd fetched a crossbow and shot the cat 3 times, laughed while it yowled and died. Sandor had stood there and watched and understood that he was guarding something worse than his brother. At least, Gregor was honest about being a monster. This boy pretended to be civilized while rotting from the inside out. But orders were orders. Tywin wanted his grandson protected. Cersei wanted her son safe. So Sandor had stayed, year after year, watching Joffrey grow from a cruel child to a cruel prince, watching himself become the weapon that enabled it all. The fire was burning low again. Sandor let it. He was tired of remembering this part, tired of seeing how he'd let himself become a tool for people who didn't deserve his service. But he'd done it anyway, for years, because what else was there? Where else could a burned, scarred killer go? What else could he be? The Hound. That's what he'd become. Joffrey's mad dog, doing things knights wouldn't do, protecting a boy who deserved no protection, and hating himself a little more each day. Everything had changed because of a girl. Sandor stared into the dying fire and felt something twist in his chest. Not pain, exactly. Something else. Something he didn't have a name for, even now. A girl. A slip of a thing with tangled hair and grey eyes that saw too much. Arya Stark, daughter of the Hand, sister to the boy king's betrothed. A child who should have been learning needlework and courtesies, preparing to be some lordling's proper wife. Instead, she'd been a wolf in girl's clothing. He'd first noticed her at court, before everything went to shit. She'd been standing with her sister during some formal reception, wearing a dress that looked uncomfortable, her face sullen with boredom, while Sansa had smiled and curtsied and played the perfect lady. Arya had looked like she wanted to stab someone. Sandor had recognized that look. He'd worn it himself often enough. The sisters had been nothing alike. Sansa was everything a highborn lady should be. Beautiful, graceful, proper. The kind of girl who believed in songs and knights and true love. The kind who looked at Sandor and tried very hard not to flinch, though she always did, just a little. He hadn't blamed her for that. He knew what he looked like. But Arya had looked at him without flinching, had studied his face the way she might study a horse or a sword, with interest but without judgment. Like his scars were just another fact about him, no more significant than his height or the color of his cloak. It had been unsettling. Later, after Ned Stark's arrest, after that fool had confessed to treason to save his daughters, Sandor had been assigned to guard Sansa. Keep her safe, keep her under control, make sure she didn't do anything stupid while the crown decided what to do with her. The older girl had been terrified of him. She tried to hide it, had smiled when she was supposed to smile, curtsied when she was supposed to curtsy. But he'd seen the fear in her eyes every time he came near. He tried, in his own rough way, to be less frightening, had spoken quietly, kept his distance, made sure she understood he wasn't going to hurt her. And when that madness had happened at the riot, when the mob had nearly torn her apart, he'd saved her, carried her back to the Red Keep through streets running with blood, protected her from men who'd wanted to do things he wouldn't let himself think about. She'd been shaking in his arms, sobbing, and he'd felt something he hadn't felt in years, the desire to protect someone who actually deserved protecting. That night, he'd gone to her chambers, had meant to check on her, make sure she was all right. But when he'd found her alone, something in him had broken open. The liquor had loosened his tongue, and he'd told her things about Gregor, about the fire, about how nights were shit and songs were lies and the world was uglier than her pretty head wanted to believe. He'd put his knife to her throat, not to hurt her, never to hurt her, but to make her understand, to make her see that danger wore many faces and kindness from a monster was still kindness. She'd sung him a song, the mother's hymn. Her voice had been soft and scared, and somehow brave, and something in Sandor's chest had twisted so hard he'd thought it might break. He'd left her there, unharmed, and walked away feeling like he'd seen something true for the first time in his life. But Arya had been different from the start. The fire popped and Sandor fed it another log, though his pile was running low. He'd need to gather more soon. But not yet. Not until he'd finished this. He'd found Arya, or she'd found him, really. After the battle at the Blackwater. After Joffrey had proven himself a coward. After Sandor had walked away from the King's Guard and the whole rotten mess of King's Landing. He'd been heading north, no real plan except to get away from the city, when he'd spotted her. A boy, he'd thought at first, dressed in rags, dirty-faced, traveling with a group of small folk fleeing the war. But something about the way she moved had caught his attention, and when he'd gotten closer, he'd recognized those eyes. Arya Stark, Ned Stark's daughter. Worth a fortune to someone, either to the Lannisters who wanted her, or to her family who'd paid to get her back. He'd taken her, simple as that, grabbed her while she'd been pissing in the woods, tied her up, thrown her on his horse. She'd fought like a wildcat, screaming and kicking and biting. He'd had to hold her down until she exhausted herself. Going to ransom you, he'd told her when she'd finally stopped struggling. Your mother will pay good gold for you, or maybe the Lannisters. Either way, you're worth something. I'm worth nothing to you, she'd spat back. My family's dead. My father's dead. Rob's probably dead. No one's going to pay for me. We'll see. That had been the beginning. Sandor took a breath, let it out slowly. Those months traveling with Arya, they'd been the strangest of his life. And maybe, in some ways, the best. She'd been a pain in the arse from the start, constantly trying to escape, arguing with everything he said, refusing to show even a hint of fear. Most people were afraid of him. Even hardened soldiers, men who'd seen battle, they'd look at the Hound and keep their distance. Not Arya. You're not that scary, she'd said once, maybe a week into their journey. You're just big and ugly and mean, but I've met worse. Oh, who's worse than me? Joffrey, the Mountain, lots of people. Your brother's dead, girl. Your family's scattered. You're at my mercy, and I could kill you any time I wanted. That doesn't scare you. She'd looked at him with those grey eyes, considering. If you wanted to kill me, you would have done it already. You want money. That means you need me alive. She'd been right, of course. Smart little wolf bitch, seeing through him like that. They'd traveled together for months, heading north, then west, then north again, following rumors of where Robb Stark's army might be, where her mother might have gone. Always one step behind, always hearing news too late. The Red Wedding had ended that. News had reached them days after it happened. The Freys had slaughtered the young wolf and all his men, had broken guest right and murdered the Starks under their own roof. Arya had gone very quiet when she'd heard. Hadn't cried, hadn't screamed. Just gotten still and cold, like ice forming over deep water. Sandor had known that stillness, had felt it himself when Grace died, when Harlan died, when every small piece of goodness in his life had been crushed. It was the feeling of something breaking inside you, something that might never be whole again. Well, he'd said, because someone had to say something. There goes your ransom. She'd looked at him then, and for the first time since he'd taken her, she'd looked like she might actually kill him. Her hand had gone to that sword she'd started carrying. Needle, she called it. A child's toy, really. And for a moment, he'd thought she'd try. But she hadn't, had just turned away and kept walking. After that, things had changed between them. He'd stopped being her captor. She'd stopped being his ransom. They'd just been traveling together. Two people moving through a broken land, trying to survive. He'd taught her things. How to move quietly, how to kill quickly, how to read danger in a man's eyes. Things she'd need to know if she wanted to live in the world the war had made. She'd taught him things too, though he hadn't realized it at the time. There was the time they'd come across a farmer and his daughter, desperate and alone, their farm burned by raiders. The farmer had offered them shelter for the night, what little food he had left, hospitality from a man who had nothing. Sandor had accepted, had eaten their food, slept in their barn, and in the morning he'd stolen their silver. Arya had been furious. They helped us. They gave us food. And now they don't have silver. That's how the world works, girl. The strong take from the weak. That's not. You're just a bully. Just like everyone else who's stronger than someone and takes what they want. That's what I am. Then you're no better than the mountain. No better than Joffrey. That had stung. More than it should have. Because she'd been right. Later, weeks later, he'd gone back. Had left the silver where the farmer would find it, along with some extra coin he'd taken off a dead soldier. He'd told himself it was practical, that he didn't need the weight. But it had been more than that. It had been because Arya had been disappointed in him. The fire crackled, and Sandor rubbed his face, feeling the familiar ridges of scar tissue. When had her opinion started to matter? When had he started caring what a child thought of him? There'd been other moments, small things that had seemed meaningless at the time, but had burrowed into him like splinters. The time they'd sheltered in an abandoned sept during a storm. Arya had found a carved wooden statue of the warrior, half burned, but still recognizable. She'd set it upright carefully, brushed the ash from it. "Don't believe in that shit," Sandor had said. "I know, but someone made this. Someone carved it and prayed to it and believed it mattered. Even if the gods aren't real, that matters." He'd had no answer for that. The time she'd tried to tend his wounds after a fight with some of the Brotherhood. He'd been slashed across the shoulder. Nothing serious but bleeding more than he'd liked. She'd torn her own shirt, one of the few clean pieces of clothing she had, to make bandages. "Why?" he'd asked. "Because you'll bleed to death if someone doesn't stop it." So? One less monster in the world. She'd tied the bandage tighter than necessary, making him wince. "You're not a monster. You're just a man who's had bad things happen to him and decided everyone else should suffer for it. What's the difference? Monsters don't get to choose. You do." The time they'd found a group of orphans hiding in a burned-out village. Children, the youngest, no more than 4, filthy and starving. Sandor had wanted to keep moving. Not their problem, not their responsibility. Arya had given them food, had used their supplies he'd stolen, supplies they needed to feed children who weren't her concern. "We can't save everyone," he'd argued. "No, but we can save them." She'd been right. They had saved those children, or at least given them a chance, had pointed them toward a sept that was still standing, where a scepter might take them in. It had been stupid, wasteful, the kind of soft-hearted gesture that got you killed in this world. But Sandor had helped her do it anyway. He took another pull from the empty wineskin, forgetting it was empty, then tossed it aside in disgust. His head was spinning, but not from drink, from memory, from trying to understand when everything had shifted. When had he started to care whether she ate? When had he started checking to make sure she was still breathing when she slept? When had he started teaching her to fight, not because it was practical, but because he was terrified of what would happen to her when he wasn't there to protect her? She'd called him out on it once. They'd been arguing about something. He couldn't even remember what. Something stupid, probably. And she'd said, "You care about me. You don't want to, but you do." "I don't care about anyone, girl." "Liar. You check on me every night. You make sure I eat first. You put yourself between me and danger every time we're in a fight." That's what people do when they care. "I'm protecting my investment." "I'm not your investment anymore. There's no ransom, no family to sell me to, but you're still here." He'd had no answer for that either. The truth was, somewhere along the way, she'd become something. Not a daughter. He wasn't fool enough to think that. But something like it. Someone who mattered. Someone whose opinion of him had weight. She'd looked at him like he could be better. Like the Hound wasn't all he was. Like underneath the scars and the brutality and the years of being a weapon for bastards, there was still a man. He wasn't sure she'd been right about that. But the fact that she'd believed it, that had changed something. There'd been a night, late in their travels, when they'd made camp in the ruins of a holdfast, some minor lord seat, burned during the war, empty now except for ghosts. They'd built a fire in what had been the great hall, and for once, Arya had been quiet, just staring at the flames. "What are you thinking about?" he'd asked. "My family, my father." She'd paused. "He told me once that the only time a man can be brave is when he's afraid. That courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right even when you're scared. Your father was a fool, got himself killed being honorable. Maybe, but at least he tried. At least he believed in something. And what do you believe in?" She'd looked at him then, those grey eyes reflecting firelight. "I believe people can choose. I believe you're not doomed to be what the world makes you. I believe you can decide to be better. I'm not better, girl. I've killed people. done terrible things, things you don't even know about. I know, but you pulled my sister out of a riot. You protected her when you didn't have to. You helped those orphans. You came back and returned that silver. You keep me safe even though there's no profit in it anymore. That doesn't make me good. No, but it means you're trying, and that matters. Sandor had stared at the fire and felt something in his chest crack open. A wall he'd built after Harlan died, after Grace died, after every small kindness in his life had been crushed. Arya had found a crack in that wall and wedged herself through. Why? He'd asked. His voice had been rough. Why do you give a shit what I am? Because someone should. Because everyone deserves at least one person who believes they can be better. Even monsters. You're not a monster. You're just hurt. There's a difference. It was almost exactly what Harlan had said all those years ago in the kennels. The same words from another person who'd seen something in him worth saving. Maybe they'd both been wrong. Probably they'd been wrong. But the fact that they'd tried, that had mattered. The fire was burning low again. Sandor's woodpile was nearly gone. Just a few pieces left. He'd have to gather more soon, or let the fire die completely. He thought about Arya now, wherever she was. He'd left her at... where had it been? The details were fuzzy, lost in fever and pain. There'd been a fight, a bad one, and he'd fallen, and she'd left him for dead. Or maybe he'd sent her away. He couldn't quite remember, but he remembered her face, the last time he'd seen it. Not frightened, not pitying, just resigned. Like she'd known all along that they'd have to part eventually, that their paths would diverge. Thank you, she'd said. Or maybe he'd imagined that. Maybe it was just what he'd wanted to hear. Either way, she was gone now, off to whatever future waited for her. And he was here, sitting alone by a fire, trying to figure out what the hell he was supposed to do with the rest of his life. Because she'd been right about one thing. He'd changed. Arya Stark, stubborn little wolf child, had cracked open something in him that he'd thought was dead, had made him question things he'd accepted for years, had made him wonder if maybe, just maybe, the Hound wasn't all he could be. She'd made him want to be better. And that was terrifying. Because wanting to be better meant admitting he'd been wrong, meant facing all the things he'd done, all the people he'd hurt, all the years he'd wasted being a weapon for men who didn't deserve his service. It meant admitting that Harlan had been right, that he'd had a choice all along, and he'd chosen wrong. But maybe, and this was the thought that kept him sitting here, feeding a dying fire in the middle of nowhere, maybe it wasn't too late to choose differently. Maybe there was still time to be something other than the Hound. He didn't know what that would look like, didn't know if he even could change after so many years of being what he'd become, didn't know if redemption was possible for someone who'd done the things he'd done. But for the first time in his life, he wanted to try, and that wanting, small and fragile as it was, felt like the beginning of something. The fire crackled softly, the night pressed close, and Sandor Clegane, the Hound, the killer, the monster, sat in the darkness and tried to imagine a future where he was something more than his scars. The fire was almost dead now. Sandor watched the last flames dance across charred wood, orange and gold fading to red, then to the dull glow of embers. Soon there would be nothing left but ash and smoke. Soon the cold would creep back in, reclaim the small circle of warmth he'd carved out of the darkness. He should add more wood, should keep the fire burning through what remained of the night. Dawn was still hours away, and the riverland's cold could seep into your bones if you weren't careful. But he didn't move, just sat there, watching the light die, feeling something settle in his chest. Not peace. He didn't know if he'd ever feel peace, but something close to it, something like understanding. He told his story, all of it, or near enough. The boy who'd been burned, the years in the shadow of a monster, the slow transformation from victim to weapon, the service to lions who'd used him without ever seeing him, and the girl who'd made him question everything he'd become. It was a shit story. No heroes, no grand moments of redemption. Just a man who'd been hurt and had spent his life hurting others in turn. A man who'd chosen cruelty because kindness had brought him nothing but pain. But it was his story, the only one he had. The embers pulsed like a dying heartbeat. Sandor pulled his cloak tighter and let the cold touch his face, the scarred side and the whole side both. The fire's warmth had masked it, but now he could feel the night air sharp against his skin, reminding him he was still alive, still here. That was something, he supposed. After everything, the wars, the battles, the injuries that should have killed him, he was still breathing, still taking up space in the world. The question was what the hell he was supposed to do with that. He thought about the path that had led him here. Not the physical journey. That was simple, enough to trace. King's Landing to the Riverlands, following roads that led nowhere in particular. But the other path, the one that had taken him from that solar in Clegane's keep to this moment, sitting alone by a dying fire. Every choice he'd made had been about survival. That's what he told himself anyway. Taking service with the Lannisters because where else could he go? Becoming Joffrey's dog because orders were orders and he needed to eat. Doing terrible things because the world was terrible and you either adapted or died. But that was horseshit, wasn't it? He'd had choices. Maybe not good ones, maybe not easy ones, but choices nonetheless. And more often than not, he'd chosen the path that made him harder, meaner, more like the monster everyone assumed he was, easier that way. If people expected you to be brutal, being brutal meant you were just meeting expectations. No disappointment, no guilt, just the simple clarity of being exactly what the world thought you were. Harlan had warned him about that. Don't let hate make you like him, the old kennel master had said. But Sandor had let it happen anyway, had wrapped himself in anger and bitterness like armor until he couldn't remember what he'd been like before the fire, before Gregor, before the world had taught him that gentleness was weakness and mercy was for fools. The night sounds continued around him. Wind through bare branches, the distant call of an owl, his horse shifting in its sleep. Normal sounds. The world going on, indifferent to his thoughts. He wondered where Arya was now. If she'd made it to wherever she'd been heading. If she was safe, or as safe as anyone could be in a world that had torn itself apart. She'd been heading for the Wall. No, that wasn't right. She'd wanted to go home, to Winterfell, but that had been impossible. The Boltons held the north now, and any Stark who showed their face would be killed. So maybe she'd gone east. Maybe she'd found a ship, sailed to Braavos, or Pentos, or one of those free cities where no one cared about Westerosi wars. Maybe she'd finally escaped. He hoped so. If anyone deserved to escape, it was her. She'd planted something in him, that girl, a seed of doubt that had taken root and grown. The question of whether he could be something other than what he'd become. Whether the Hound was all there was, or if somewhere underneath the scars and the savagery there was still a man named Sandor. He didn't know the answer to that, wasn't sure there was an answer. Maybe you couldn't separate them. Maybe Sandor and the Hound were so tangled together by now that pulling them apart would destroy what remained. But maybe it was worth trying anyway. The embers were fading fast now, barely giving off light. Sandor reached for his woodpile and found it empty. He'd burned through everything he'd gathered. That seemed fitting somehow. All the fuel consumed, nothing left but to decide whether to let the fire die or find more to burn. He stood, his joints protesting after sitting still for so long. His shoulder ached. The wound from that fight weeks ago hadn't healed quite right. His ribs hurt where they'd been broken last year. The bones set poorly. His face, as always, carried the phantom pain of burning. He was getting old. Not old, not like Harlan had been, but old enough to feel it. Old enough to know that the years of fighting and killing were leaving marks that went deeper than scars. How much longer could he keep doing this? Being a sword for hire, drifting from place to place, taking whatever work came his way. How much longer before some younger, faster fighter put a blade in his gut and left him bleeding in a ditch? And if he stopped, if he decided to be something else, what the hell would that even look like? He walked to the edge of his camp, where the trees grew thick and close. Deadwood was scarce this time of year, but he found a few branches that would burn, carried them back to the fire and added them one by one to the embers. The wood caught slowly, smoke first, then small flames licking at the bark. It wasn't much, but it was enough to push back the darkness for a while longer. Sandor sat back down and watched the fire rebuild itself. There was a metaphor in that, probably. Something about rising from ashes, about finding light in darkness, the sort of thing singers would make into a pretty song. But life wasn't a song. Songs ended cleanly, with heroes triumphant and lessons learned. Real life was messier, harder, full of choices that all felt wrong and consequences that lasted longer than they should. He thought about the people he'd killed, not in battle. Those deaths were just part of war, soldiers killing soldiers. But the others, the servant he'd thrown from the cliff, the merchant whose hands he'd broken, the people he'd beaten or threatened or destroyed because that was the job, and he'd been good at his job. Did they haunt him? He'd wondered about that. Sometimes. The singers always talked about ghosts, about the dead coming back to demand justice. But Sandor had never seen a ghost, never felt the cold touch of supernatural vengeance. What haunted him was memory, the knowledge of what he'd done, carried in his head like stones. Some days, he could ignore it, push it down, tell himself it didn't matter. Other days, days like this, the weight was almost too much to bear. He couldn't undo any of it, couldn't bring back the dead or unmake the choices that had led him here. The past was written, unchangeable, a litany of sins that would follow him to his grave. But maybe, and this was the thought that Arya had planted, the seed that had grown into something he couldn't ignore. Maybe the future didn't have to be the same as the past. Maybe he could choose differently going forward. It sounded simple when he thought it that way. Just make better choices. Be less of a bastard. Try to help instead of hurt. It should be easy, but it wasn't easy. Nothing about it was easy, because choosing to be better meant facing what he'd been, meant admitting that he'd been wrong, that he'd wasted years being a weapon for people who didn't deserve his service, meant accepting that he'd become exactly what Gregor had tried to make him, a monster who hurt people because hurting was all he knew. And more than that, it meant risk. Being kind in a cruel world meant making yourself vulnerable, opening yourself up to disappointment, to betrayal, to the same pain that had shaped him in the first place. It meant trusting that maybe, just maybe, the world had room for something other than violence and suffering. That was a hard thing to believe when you'd lived the life he'd lived. The fire crackled, stronger now. The flames cast dancing shadows across the clearing, turned the trees into dark pillars that seemed to lean in close. Sandor watched the light and thought about all the fires he'd known, the one that had scarred him, the ones he'd built in military camps, surrounded by men who'd feared him, the one at the Blackwater where he'd finally broken and walked away from everything, the small fire in the sept where Arya had found that statue and set it right, reminding him that even broken things could matter. Fire destroyed. That's what he'd always known about it. Fire consumed everything it touched, left nothing but ash. But fire also gave warmth, gave light, made it possible to cook food, to forge steel, to survive the long, cold nights. It was a tool, not good or evil in itself. What mattered was how you used it. Maybe he was like that too. A tool, a weapon, something that could destroy or protect depending on who wielded it. For years he'd let others wield him, Tywin, Cersei, Joffrey. Let them point him at targets and pull the trigger. But tools could choose their own hands, couldn't they? A sword could be set down. A fire could be banked or built up or allowed to die. He could choose. The thought should have been freeing. Instead, it was terrifying. Because choice meant responsibility. Meant he couldn't blame Gregor anymore. Couldn't blame father. Couldn't blame the world for making him what he was. He'd made himself, one decision at a time. And if he wanted to be something different, he'd have to unmake himself the same way. One choice at a time. Start small, maybe. Don't kill unless there's no other option. Don't take coin for hurting people. Don't look away when someone needs help, even if helping is inconvenient. Simple rules. The sort of thing Harlan might have taught him, if he'd been willing to listen back then. Could he follow them? He honestly didn't know. Years of being the Hound had carved grooves in him, patterns of behavior that would be hard to break. His first instinct was always violence, always suspicion, always the assumption that people were shit and would betray you if given the chance. But maybe first instincts could be questioned. Maybe he could learn to pause, to think, to choose the harder path instead of the familiar one. It would be slow work, probably fail more than succeed. There'd be days, lots of days, where he'd slip back into old patterns, where the Hound would win out over whatever better thing he was trying to become. But Arya's voice echoed in his head. You're trying, and that matters. Maybe trying was enough. Maybe you didn't have to succeed at being good. You just had to keep attempting it, keep choosing it, even when it was hard, even when it felt pointless. The fire was burning steady now, the new wood catching well. Warmth spread through the clearing, pushed back the cold. Sandor held his hands toward the flames and felt the heat on his palms. Not painful, not threatening, just warm. He thought about tomorrow. He'd need to move on from this spot, find food, figure out where he was going. The practical concerns of survival, the same ones that had occupied him for weeks. But beyond tomorrow, beyond the next meal, the next town, the next stretch of road, he didn't know. For the first time in his life, he had no master, no orders, no clear destination, just himself and whatever choices he made. It was strange not having someone to tell him what to do. Strange and frightening, and somehow freeing. Maybe he'd head north. The wall was always looking for men, and they didn't ask too many questions about your past. Fighting wildlings and whatever the hell was beyond the wall, that was honest work at least. Protecting the realm instead of serving some lord's ambitions. Or maybe he'd stay in the Riverlands, try to help rebuild what the war had destroyed. There were plenty of people who needed protecting, small folk left vulnerable, orphans like the ones Arya had fed, farmers trying to plant crops in burned fields. He could do that, could be a sword for people who actually needed one, instead of for bastards who just wanted more power. Or maybe something else entirely. The world was wide, and he'd spent most of his life seeing only a small part of it. Maybe there were places where no one knew the Hound, where he could start fresh without the weight of his reputation. He didn't have to decide tonight, didn't have to have all the answers. He just had to choose to keep going, keep trying, keep believing that maybe there was something worth salvaging in himself. The stars were visible through breaks in the clouds now, hard points of light in the darkness, the same stars that had been there the night he was burned, the same stars that had watched him become the Hound, watched him kill and hurt and do terrible things, but also the same stars that had watched Harlan teach him kindness, that had watched him save Sansa, that had watched him protect Arya, even when there was no profit in it. The stars didn't judge, they just bore witness. And maybe that was enough. Sandor took a breath, long and slow, let it out, and felt something in his chest ease. Not forgiveness. He didn't deserve that, and wouldn't have known what to do with it if he had. But acceptance, maybe. Acknowledgement that he was what he was. And that was a place to start from. He'd been burned as a child and had spent his life burning in turn. Had let that first fire shape everything that came after. Had become hard and cruel and vicious because that seemed like the only way to survive in a world that had hurt him so badly. But fire also tempered, made steel stronger. Maybe, just maybe, all that heat and pain had forged something in him that could still be useful, still be good, if he chose to use it that way. He wasn't redeemed, wasn't forgiven, wasn't magically transformed into a better man just because he'd spent a night remembering his sins and feeling bad about them. But he was still here, still breathing, still capable of making choices, and tomorrow he'd make one. Then another, the day after. Small choices, probably. Nothing heroic or grand. Just the choice to be a little less of a bastard than he'd been before. That was all anyone could do, really. Wake up each day and try to be better than they were yesterday. Fail sometimes. Fail often. But keep trying anyway. The fire burned bright and warm. Sandor looked at it without flinching, without fear, and saw not the flames that had marked him, but the light that pushed back darkness. He'd spent his life being the Hound, being a weapon, a tool, a thing that hurt people, because that's what he was made for. But weapons could be beaten into plowshares, Dogs could be gentle as well as fierce, and men could change, even men who thought they were too broken to be fixed. The night was long, but dawn would come eventually. It always did. And when it came, Sandor Clegane would still be sitting here, scarred and damaged and angry, but also something else. Alive, aware, and for the first time in years, willing to try. He tossed another log on the fire, a small act, but deliberate, a choice to keep the light burning a little longer, to stay warm a little longer, to keep going. The flames rose, bright and hungry, consuming the wood, but also giving warmth and light in exchange for fuel. A fair trade, maybe, better than most he'd known. Sandor settled back against the fallen oak and closed his eyes. Not to sleep, not yet, just to rest, to sit with himself and all that he'd remembered, to accept it, carry it, and decide to keep walking forward despite its weight. Tomorrow would bring new choices, new chances to fail or succeed at being something better than what he'd been. But tonight, for this moment, it was enough to sit by the fire and know that he wanted to try. That wanting was small and fragile, like a spark in darkness. But sparks could grow into flames if you fed them, and flames could light the way forward, even when the path was unclear. Sandor Clegane, the Hound, the Burn Boy, the killer, the monster, sat in the darkness and waited for dawn. And when it came, as it always did, as it always would, he would rise and continue, not redeemed, not forgiven, not changed completely, but trying. And for now, that would have to be enough. The fire crackled softly, the night breathed around him, and somewhere in the ruins of who he'd been, something new began to grow.